All right. Hello, everybody. I am Dustin Seabell, co-director of the Lafrac Forum, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Ariel Helfer, who had been a Spartan, I guess, at one point in his life. It is now
What's a Spartan?
in no way a Spartan.
Oh,
and it's I don't know, maybe a Theban, Athenian.
I really haven't thought about it.
Yeah, let's not go too far down that rabbit hole. In any event, it's a great pleasure to have Ariel here, and so join me in welcoming you.
Thank you very much. I have a talk for you today. I've called it the presentation of philosophy in Plato's letters. Plato, of course, is famous for his dialogues. Philosophic dramas in which usually his teacher Socrates engages in conversations, often refutations, with a variety of other characters. And for the most part, that's how Plato's corpus is known, as being composed of those dialogues. He also, together with those dialogues that have come down to us through a very long tradition of manuscript copying, we also have some letters said to have been written by Plato, just as the dialogues were. In the last couple of hundred years, those letters have not exactly been disregarded, but they have been often dismissed. Above all, it's highly doubted whether any or even all of them are by Plato at all. And this has happened with a number of the dialogues as well, but essentially it's now widely believed that some or even all of these letters that come down to us along with the rest of the Platonic corpus were not written by Plato, were forgeries by forgers hoping to make money selling them to libraries, or other things that were erroneously included at some point with the Platonic corpus. It must have been rather early if that's what happened incidentally, but in any case, that's how it's generally viewed. Now, my thesis, the basis of the book project that I'm currently working on, from which this talk today will be drawn, is that the letters have been Plato's letters have been badly misunderstood for at least a couple of centuries and maybe longer. The thesis is that the letters are not actually letters. Plato didn't write them as letters. That actually they constitute together something like an epistolary novel that Plato wrote, a work of semi-fictional, semi-autobiographical, but Platonic political philosophy, meant to occupy a place in Plato's corpus, and look like letters. That's why they've been thought to be letters, but in fact it's a work of Platonic philosophy. So the book project has three parts. It's got an introduction where I defend that thesis and kind of explain why the letters have been misunderstood for so long. It's got a new English translation of the letters intended for readers who are interested in approaching the text with that thesis in mind, and entertaining that thesis, and then an interpretive essay. And my talk today is the second of three parts of the interpretive essay. About the presentation of philosophy in the letters. I'm not going to do anything to defend the very unusual thesis that I just laid before you. I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A, but except for the fact that by presenting you some interpretive ideas that draw together threads from a number of the different letters, maybe you'll be persuaded that there is this kind of cohesiveness and interplay between the letters that suggests a unitary work. So just the tiniest bit of kind of background, there are 13 letters in the collection. All of them are from Plato to someone. Generally, they are political in character. Plato, they depict Plato in his activity as a political actor in the Greek world. In fact, I would say, for someone turning to the letters, they are likely to be disappointingly political in character. By which I mean someone who comes from the dialogues where Plato never speaks in his own name, is always behind the scenes, is always, when you read the dialogue, it's like so to speak, reading Shakespeare, if you want to know what Hamlet thinks, that's one thing. You want to know what Shakespeare thinks, that's quite a bit more difficult. So likewise, you read the dialogues, it's not always so clear what Plato himself thinks. And so we turn to the letters with some excitement that this is Plato speaking in his own name. And yet, he doesn't speak about some of the things, many of the things that we would be most excited to hear him talk about. He doesn't talk about his education at the hands of Socrates. He doesn't talk about his activity in the academy in Athens, founding and teaching the academy, writing the dialogues, practicing, living a life of philosophy. Instead, it's this political life that he's telling, the political dimension of his life. That's really the substance and theme of the letters. Now, that's not to say that philosophy isn't present in the letters, by any means, in fact. One thing to note is that it's quite clear from the letters that Plato conducted much of his political activity around Greece for the sake of philosophy, especially promoting its reputation. And now that means that much of the discussion of philosophy in the letters has to do with the political role of philosophy, or the role of philosophy, or the role philosophy can play in the political realm, rather than what philosophy was for Plato in its own right, as he practiced it, the practice to which he dedicated his entire life. However, there are a couple of passages in the letters that seem to give something of a portrayal of philosophy in its more accurate proportions, more honest portrayal. And so my idea here today is to chart a course through almost the whole presentation of philosophy throughout Plato's letters. So you have a handout, if you don't have one, they're down around there in the back somewhere. Where I have printed out a number of passages that I'll be reading and discussing and kind of presenting and sharing an interpretation. So this course that I'm charting through the presentation of philosophy in the letters begins in letter 7. Letter 7 is by far the longest. By itself, it's as long as all the others combined. So it's really a fairly long letter. It's attracted the most attention from scholars and readers of various kinds. It's the most heavily studied. And it tells the story, one of the reasons why it's so much more widely studied aside from its length, the content, it tells the story, its own narrative thread is the story of Plato's activity in the Sicilian city of Syracuse, which was a major city in 4th century BC Greece. And Plato's activity in Syracuse, in fact, is not just the connecting narrative thread of letter 7, but of the whole letters. Of 13 letters, 10 of them directly or indirectly deal with Plato's dealings in Syracuse. So it'll be helpful to have just a very brief summary of what that was all about. Plato traveled 3 times to Syracuse over the course of his life. The first time Plato was 40, he met a young man named Dion, D-I-O-N. Dion was 20. Dion was related by marriage to the ruling family of Syracuse, ruled as a tyranny, and a monarchy at any rate, not to editorialize. Hot button issue, the government of Syracuse in 360 BC. Dion related by marriage to the ruling family of Syracuse, and Dion was converted to an ardent passion for Platonic philosophy, which he held for the rest of his life. He was 20 at the time, and so he was converted to a devotee of Platonic philosophy. Now, Plato had his time in Syracuse and returned to Athens, founded the academy, he wrote lots of dialogues. 20 years later, the ruler of Syracuse died, and his son, Dionysius, the younger, they were both named Dionysius. Dionysius the younger, so not Dion, but Dionysius, took the throne. This is Dion's nephew, something like that. And Dion wrote to Plato and said, come back, invited him to come back to provide Dionysius, the new tyrant, with a philosophic education. Plato went. It was a catastrophic failure. He managed to make his way home. 7 years later, he was invited again. With great resistance, he went a third time, again tried to have relations with the, productive relations with the tyrant of Syracuse, Dionysius. Failure again, returned home. That was it, he never went back. A few years later, Dion, who had been in exile since almost the beginning of this undertaking, because it really went very badly, as I say, So Dion had been in exile for almost a year. He'd had enough of it, and he raised an army and marched on his native Syracuse and plunged Syracuse into a civil war that lasted beyond the end of Plato's life. So everything went really very poorly. Now in letter 7, the telling of this story begins, you might say, with what might be the most memorable or striking statement on philosophy in all of the letters. And I say that because the statement I have in mind, which I've printed out for you, presents itself as the explanation of how Plato arrived at the doctrine of philosopher kingship, for which he's famous, for example, specifically from the Republic, the doctrine that the best regime is the rule of philosophers, the rule of philosophy. It's an autobiographical section in which he explains, effectively, it culminates in him saying, this is where that came from, and how I decided to bring it to Sicily. Now, on the occasion of his first journey there. Now, my view is ultimately that Plato did not believe in the doctrine of philosopher kingship, despite his being famous for it in the Republic and here in the letters, and that it was never his intention to set up the rule of philosopher kingship in Syracuse. That's a claim that, there is much discussion, has been for a very long time in the study of Plato about Plato's disposition to that doctrine. I can't really defend it, but I can begin to give an idea. So the first, number 1, passage number 1, I won't read the whole thing, but this is the passage I was just describing. And Plato has just talked about the source of his disillusionment with political activity, and especially how much seeing the way Athens treated his friend, as he says, Socrates, how much that disillusioned him and turned him off from political activity. And so then he says, I was examining the human beings who were doing the political things and also the laws and customs. And the more I carefully examined and advanced in age, the harder it appeared to be to manage the political things correctly. For one cannot act without men who are friends and faithful companions. All the emphasis is just mine for emphasizing some things I mean to bring out. And let me just skip to the end here, because he concludes then with this statement you'll recognize if you know the relevant passage in the Republic. Therefore, human races will not cease from evils until either the race of those philosophizing correctly and truly, that is, should come into the positions of political rule, or that of those who are in power in the cities will by some divine faith really philosophize. In other words, that's him saying humanity is not going to, the only salvation for humanity is philosophic rule, the rule of philosophers. Now, Plato makes it very clear in the letter that Dion bought into this idea of philosophic rule. That was the purpose of the invitation that Plato received. Come to Syracuse and teach Dionysius philosophy and turn him into a philosopher so we can have philosophic rule just like you've always talked about. Less immediately obvious, but quite undeniable upon reflection in reading letter 7, is that Dion's understanding of philosophy was highly problematic to begin with and always. And I'll begin to kind of sketch the idea there by raising this question about the passage I just read. How is philosophy supposed to solve the problem that Plato identifies? That problem of the lack of trustworthy friendship. That's the problem he kind of emphasizes. How am I ever going to find someone whom I can trust well enough to act with, in concert with, in the duplicitous, deceitful, treacherous world of politics? There are no grounds for friendship strong enough to be effective. But then he says in the end, but we can escape all our ills if philosophers will. How is philosophy supposed to solve the problem of trust in politics? To clarify, I think Plato's view is philosophy can serve as the basis for a stronger form of friendship than is available to us otherwise. But how you think philosophy can be the basis of such a friendship matters. It makes a big difference in whether this doctrine of philosophic rule pans out and really works or doesn't. And so let me just start by pointing out, there's no really good answer to the question I've raised anywhere in letter 7. Nowhere in letter 7, the long letter 7, is it ever explained, even though the idea is really a motif. Once you see it, it kind of pervades the letter. Philosophy is what you need to have friendship for the sake of politics. But how philosophy produces friendship, that's never said. On the other hand, letter 10, a different letter, is here very instructive. And so I have it. It's the shortest letter in the whole collection, in the whole letter. So I printed it here in its entirety. You can read it in its entirety. Plato to Aristodorus, someone whom we don't know anything else about. Do well. That's Plato's coinage as a greeting. I hear from Dion that you are now, and have come to be through everything, among those who are, most of all his companions, exhibiting a character that is the wisest one with a view to philosophy. For it is the steadfast, faithful, and healthy that I myself claim is the true philosophy. And as for the other wisdoms and clevernesses which extend to other things, I suppose that I name them correctly by calling them niceties, refinements. Be strong, remain in the characters in which you are. This then is how Plato speaks about philosophy to people in Dion's orbit, in Dion's world. Philosophy is loyalty, steadfastness. That's all there is to be said about it. Don't get caught up in all the other wisdoms and clevernesses. Don't try to be clever. Don't seek cleverness. Don't even really seek wisdom. It's loyalty. The most charitable way to interpret this would be to try to connect it to the well-known Socratic dictum, virtue is knowledge. Socrates is very famous for advancing that thesis throughout the Platonic dialogues and elsewhere. But there's a lot of problems with that. For one thing, these aren't virtues. Not virtues we're used to talking about anyway. It's not wisdom and courage and moderation and justice. It's steadfastness and health. And more importantly, virtue is knowledge is one thing. That's not the same as saying virtue is philosophy. Philosophy is inquiry. Philosophy is an activity. It's between ignorance and knowledge, or it's on the way to knowledge. And that's key. If we look back at letter 7 as a whole, and at Dion's view of philosophy, or the idea of the view of philosophy that Plato associates with Dion in letter 7, we find it's never depicted as an activity. And that, I think, is very much, when I say Dion's understanding of philosophy was always problematic, that's a good starting point for what I mean, or what that would mean. So let me propose then this interpretation. In order for Plato to maintain that the kind of friendship engendered by philosophy is suitable for politics, for solving the problem of trust in politics that he identified, in order to claim that, philosophy has to be dramatically distorted, largely by abstracting from its character as an activity of inquiring into nature. And I propose that that hypothesis could be brought to a reading of the Republic in addition to of the letters. But it means that the less Plato is committed on any given occasion to insisting that philosophy can solve the political problem, the more willing he is to show philosophy as it really is. And letter 6 represents an interesting step in that direction. In letter 6, Plato is writing to 3 men as a group. Their names are Erastus, Coriscus, and Hermias. Hermias is the ruler of a city called Atarneus, which is in Ionia, which is modern-day Western Turkey. And Erastus and Coriscus are men that Plato says he knows very well who live nearby to Hermias in Ionia. Plato says they spent a long part of their lives with Plato and Plato's entourage in Athens, attending to what he calls, as you'll see in this passage, the beautiful wisdom of the forms. The forms, the famous Platonic metaphysical doctrine. So, Plato's purpose in this, now, not so, Plato's purpose in this letter is to forge a friendship between the 3 of them. And what he wants for his friends, Erastus and Coriscus, is protection. So we can see this in number 3a from letter 6. As for Erastus and Coriscus, in addition to this beautiful wisdom of the forms, I claim, even though I'm old, he's quoting a poem there, you don't quite know which one, that they have need of wisdom that guards against the wicked and unjust, and of a certain defensive power. For they are inexperienced on account of having been occupied with us, who are, us here in Athens, who are measured and not bad for a long part of their life. They're naive, they're innocent, they're here with us in the academy, doesn't mention the academy, never mentions the academy by name in the whole letters. But they spend all their time with us. We're measured, we're not bad. They don't know what it's like out there. They can't protect themselves. They're babes in the woods. And so they have need of this certain defensive power. This is why I said they have need of these things in addition, lest they be compelled to be careless of the true wisdom in order to take care over the human and compulsory wisdom more than they need to, a wisdom which Hermes is said to have. So so much time in philosophy, which is good. You want them to attend to the true wisdom. Plato wants them to be able to spend all their time in wisdom, in the pursuit of the true wisdom, and not to have to worry about how do you make it in the world, how do you defend yourself against all the ne'er-do-wells out there. And so they need this protection from Hermes. They don't know how to do that themselves. Now, what is Hermes to get out of this? Plato says, well, the greatest power that you still stand to gain is not from money, military troops, military allies, have all that. The greatest power you still have to gain is from trustworthy friendship. So there's an allusion here to the problem identified in letter 7. It's very hard to have stable friendships in politics, especially if you're a tyrant, like Hermes is. And this, one might think here of Xenophon's Hero, where that's thematic. However, the problem here is that Erastus and Coriscus are explicitly said to be useless when it comes to politics. Now, as we might also gather from Xenophon's Hero, in a way that's good for Plato and for them, because being so hapless, they pose no threat. If you send over a couple people, I think you'll like these guys, they're real savvy, they're real operators. Then Hermes the tyrant has to hold them at arm's length. You can never really be sure what they're up to. But being these wide-eyed innocents who only want to sit around and, draw polygons in the sand and think about the stars and the forms, they pose no threat. They don't have those wiles. But it also means that the promise that Plato was making here to Hermes is not for a resolution of the political problem we were looking at. In fact, Hermes doesn't really seem to have much of a political problem. He's got money, he's got troops, he's got allies. This is especially evident if you juxtapose letter 6 with letter 5, which is very much called for. If you read the letters, you realize 5 and 6 form a kind of pair. In letter 5, Plato sends one of his associates to a young tyrant, Perdiccas, forerunner of Alexander the Great in Macedon. Plato sends him an advisor and says, you're young, you need help. This guy, associate of mine, he can help you. He has political knowledge, and it describes what it pertains to. That's not what happens here in letter 6. And so Plato is not proposing political help. He's not proposing take these guys as political counselors, advisors. On the other hand, the proposal is some kind of friendship, and it is explicit that philosophy is the key to that friendship. So, reading the next passage now that I have printed from letter 6. With respect to this friendship and community, whenever we and you all shall philosophize insofar as we're capable and is appropriate to each of us, the authoritative oracles just now delivered will come to be. Plato refers to everything he has said in this letter about the friendship he is proposing and how it's to work as oracular statements he was giving. But if we don't, they won't. I'll skip to the next part there. All of you being free ought to read this letter, use it as a compact and authoritative law. Swearing, and now Plato really blasts off, swearing by the God who is leader of all things that are and will be, a lordly father of the leader and cause, whom, if we really philosophize, we all shall know as clearly as is within the power of happy human beings. It's very mystical, also very convoluted grammatically. Those can go together. What we have here then is a presentation of philosophy as an activity. Notice that you have in the printout here in that last passage both occurrences of the word for philosophy in letter 6. Both of them are the verb to philosophize, which is relatively rare in the letters. Philosophy, the word appears many times as a verb very rarely. So it's presentation of philosophy as an activity with its goal being an understanding of the cosmic deity, and the implication that obtaining this knowledge together as a group will somehow coincide with or produce genuine friendship. Which means it goes quite a bit beyond letter 7 in explaining how philosophy is to somehow be the glue, the foundation of, producer of friendship. But I think it's fair to say the letter in the end has something of a tongue-in-cheek quality. Plato, it's clear, is very worried that this whole thing is not going to work out. In parts of the letter I didn't include elaborate measures Plato is taking. It starts to fall apart, write to me and we'll figure it out. And to put things, kind of, to take what Plato's doing and present it in kind of abstract terms, Plato is trying here to legislate. He calls this letter a law. He says, read this letter together, make it your law. Plato is trying to legislate an alliance between philosophers and ruler for the sake of safety for the philosophers, without allowing the philosophers to seem any threat to the ruler, and therefore not able to offer political benefits, really, and so offering instead philosophy itself as the basis for this deeper kind of friendship for the ruler. But that means a very rosy picture of philosophy. Do your best. Philosophize insofar as you're able to do so. We'll all do it. Insofar as is appropriate to you. And if we all do that, we'll all come to know the cosmic deity as much as is possible for happy human beings. I mean, it's very optimistic. And there's a note of uncertainty even in what I printed but didn't read. And as I say, there's, I think, uncertainty looming over the whole thing. But the presentation of philosophy is very rosy. In letter 2, we get a very different portrait of the practice, of the activity of philosophy. The context is as follows. After Plato's final departure from Syracuse, but before Dion has turned around and marched on Syracuse and plunged the place into civil war, Dionysius, as we learn in the letter 2, has written to Plato because he's reached a philosophic impasse in his own thinking, Dionysius has, and become concerned. He hopes that Plato can help him with it by explaining a piece of his philosophy, Plato's philosophy, that Dionysius has never been able to understand, referred to here in the letter as the nature of the first. Dionysius has apparently said, you need to explain to me the nature of the first. I've never understood that, and I've entered a state of perplexity and concern. And Plato says, all right, I'll explain it. And the passage that follows is the only place in the Platonic corpus where Plato presents himself as teaching his philosophy directly to anyone. The only thing that comes close is a passage in letter 7, probably the most famous passage of the letters. It seems to offer a primer in Platonic metaphysics. I'm going to discuss both of those passages. Before I discuss the passages themselves, I want to discuss a crucial link between them. And that's the fact that in both places, Plato frames the discussion of philosophy with the question of how, and indeed whether, to write about philosophy. In letter 2, Plato says, yes, I'll explain the nature of the first, but I have to do so in riddles. The Greek word is enigmon, it's where we get enigma, so I have to say it in enigmas. So that, if anything should happen to this letter, if it should fall into the wrong hands on its way to you, whoever gets their hands on it won't be able to understand it. I'm sending it along with Archidemus, who's the guy who's ferrying their letters back and forth, and he'll explain it to you. And so then he gives the enigmas, and we'll talk about them a little bit. And then he gets back to this question of writing. So this is excerpt number 4. Beware, however, lest these things ever be exposed to uneducated human beings. For as it seems to me, there are for the many almost no more ridiculous things to be heard than these, nor indeed, for those of good natures, any more amazing and more inspiring. But being spoken often and for many years, they are with difficulty, like gold, purified with much diligent activity. So beware in examining these things, lest you come someday to regret their having been unworthily exposed now. A very great safeguard is not to write, but to learn by heart, for it is not possible for things written not to be exposed. Because of these things, I have never written anything at all about these things, nor are there written works of Plato, nor will there be any at all. But those now spoken of are of a Socrates become beautiful and young. Very famous line in the letters. Very cryptic. Be strong and be persuaded, and as soon as you've read this letter many times, burn it up. Now, there's something ridiculous about his saying burn it. Because I thought you wrote it in code, so it wouldn't matter if it fell into the wrong hands. Then why does he need to burn it? And maybe more to the point, Plato says it is not possible for something written not to be exposed, which means he must always have assumed that everything he wrote would eventually be published. Every text message, every email, you have to assume it's going to be exposed to the world. You have to write that way. So then why would it need to be burned? Why beware exposing it unworthily and so on? Why these warnings? Don't expose it unworthily, burn the letter. One thing to point out is how intriguing it is, both for Dionysius, the recipient of the letter, and the kind of fiction of the letter, but also for us as the readers of the letter. Obviously Dionysius didn't burn it, right? We have it. How intriguing it is, how tantalizing it is to have in our hands a letter from Plato that says, here's a riddle containing my secret philosophy. Memorize it and burn it. The effect of those warnings, I think, is not to be underestimated as a reason for their being there. But look at what he actually says. Going back to what I just read, that people will think, who do read this letter that aren't the intended recipients. Just at the beginning in bold. There are for the many almost no more ridiculous things to be heard than these, nor indeed for those of good natures any more amazing and more inspired. So that's what Plato thinks is going to happen if someone reads this. For the many, they'll think it's ridiculous. For those of good natures, whatever that means, they'll think that these things are amazing and inspiring. But notice, it would be a mistake for us to take him to be saying, well, the many won't understand it and the good-natured will. In fact, these are both subcategories of the uneducated whom Plato says don't let them see it. The many will think it's ridiculous. Those of good natures will think it's amazing and inspired, but that doesn't mean they'll understand it. That can still be a misunderstanding to think that it's amazing and inspired. Everyone, says Plato, has to listen over and over to his speeches for years in order to purify them and find the gold. You have the gold ore, you need to smelt it to get the schmutz out or whatever. I don't smelt a lot of ore myself, but that's the idea as I understand it. Earlier in the letter, in reference to the difficulties that Dionysius has encountered, these philosophic difficulties that he's run into, Plato says, no one after hearing, I didn't print this, but no one after hearing me for the first time has ever been in any other state than this, the one you're in, at first. And though one has more problems and another has fewer, they are rid of them only with difficulty, and almost no one has few. So everybody has to struggle. There are no exceptions. These ones of good natures, they're not understanding it either. And so there are a couple of misunderstandings that Plato predicts will take place. Keep all that in mind now as we turn to the Philosophic Digression, famous passage known as Philosophic Digression of letter 7. Plato comes to a point in letter 7 where he feels he must address a rumor that he has heard. The rumor is that Dionysius has written, by the way, this is after the death of Dion, so that it's already in civil war. The rumor Dionysius lives. The rumor is Dionysius has written a book in which he claims to lay out the fundamentals of Platonic philosophy. So the whole thing about don't tell people about this stuff, that didn't work, right? Perhaps predictably. In fact, Plato seems to have predicted it. Of course, now it should be mentioned, Plato says he wrote this as a book claiming to explain my philosophy, but he claims that it's his own. He's denying, he never mentions that so it's plagiarism, to boot. Now Plato says, I haven't read it, I haven't seen it. Who's read it? Not me. But I can guarantee you that if he wrote this thing, he doesn't understand what I think about the things that I take seriously. Because no one who understood those things would ever attempt to write about them. And so here, passage 5a, it begins with this line that very clearly echoes what was said in letter 2. There is no writing of mine, at least, concerning the things I take seriously, nor will there ever come to be one. But now something different. For it is in no way speakable, as are the other subjects of learning, but rather from the coming to be of much intercourse concerning the problem itself and living together suddenly, as from a jumping fire, a light is kindled. And having come to be in the soul, it straightway nourishes itself. This is not something that can just be spoken. You can't just tell somebody. You have to live together, spend a long time together, discourse about it regularly, and then there will be this kind of mystical leap, and all of a sudden they have it. Now they really have it. But you can't just say it. You can't just write it. And yet, I know this much at least, that in being written or said by me, they would be said best. And that if they were written badly, that is by someone else, it would pain me not least. But if they appeared to me to be sufficiently writable and speakable to the many, what nobler thing could have been done in life by us than this? Both to write something that's a great benefit for human beings and to lead nature forth into the light for all. Therefore, if you think you understood what I know about the things I take seriously, and then you thought you could write about them, obviously you didn't understand. Now the irony is, this passage is an introduction to the passage that is seen as the clearest exposition and explanation of Platonic metaphysics and epistemology in all of Plato's writings. I mean, so there's a puzzle here for us to solve. How can the claim that it is impossible to write about the highest things in philosophy be the introduction to the clearest exposition of the highest things in philosophy that Plato ever wrote? But notice the difference between this explanation of why Plato doesn't write and the one in letter 2. In letter 2, he didn't say that it's impossible to communicate about these things. He said he didn't want to risk it being exposed. He had to hide it. How do those fit together, or which one is more accurate? I think there's something to be said for the version, by the way, in these two very similar parallel lines. There is no writing in Plato. One says they belong, the ones that you hear about, that you've read, they belong to this new beautified Socrates. I think there's something to be said for the version that acknowledges the Socratic writings. It seems to go further in explaining what Plato was doing in his approach. But let's finish the passage. The 5b immediately follows what we just read. But the undertaking spoken of concerning them, that is, the attempt to write about these things, I do not hold to be good for human beings, unless for some few, however many, are themselves capable of finding them out through a small indication. Of the others, it would fill some, in no way harmoniously, with incorrect disdain, and others with a lofty and empty hope, as though they had learned some august things. Now this is different from what immediately preceded. It sounds more like letter 2. The attempt to illuminate the order of nature wouldn't be good for most people, but Plato could actually communicate this way, through writing, to a very few. Those few who are able to catch on to what he meant by a small indication. And now, compare the reactions of the rest of Plato's readers, would-be readers, that he's just described here in letter 7, with what he said in letter 2 about people's reactions if they were to get a hold of that letter, letter 2. In letter 2, it was, the many would think these are the most ridiculous things, the good-natured would think they're the most amazing and inspired things. And here Plato says, apart from those very few who would get it, some would be filled with disdain, and others with lofty and empty hope as though they learned august things. Those are two very closely parallel characterizations of the way in which Plato's works would be interpreted. In letter 2, he says that's how they would see this letter. In letter 7, he says that's how they would understand me if I ever wrote about these things, which I don't. But when you put them together, I think what becomes clear is the passage in letter 7 purports to be an explanation of why Plato never wrote about what he took seriously, and turns out to be an explanation of how he did write about those things. So very few, very astute would catch on by a small indication, and the rest would have these reactions that we know from letter 2 Plato thinks will be the reactions of readers of his work, for the most part. The uneducated, anyways, he puts it in letter 2. All right. That is, I think, the clearest linkage between the two passages in philosophy, the one in letter 2 and the one in letter 7. Let's turn to the enigmas of letter 2, on the nature of the first. So this is passage number 6. Plato says, I'll explain the nature of the first to you, and then it's going to have to be in riddles and enigmas, and then he says this riddling, enigmatic thing. All things are around the king of all things, and all things are for the sake of him, and that is responsible for all the noble things. The second things are around the second, the third things around the third. So there, that clears it up. Three main things I want to note about this. First, and you know, this passage has been read and interpreted so many ways. Some people think the three are the Holy Trinity, and other people, the king is the idea of the good, the king is mind. There are many different interpretations over the millennia that have been offered. I think it's really important not to assume that we are to try to link this to anything else in Plato's writing or elsewhere. Just to take what we're given on the page. Three things I'll note. First, this is a picture of a whole that is well ordered. There's a suggestion of a tripartition of the beings comprising the whole. That the cleanness of that partition is undermined by Plato saying all things are around the king of all things. So it's not a clean tripartition, but whatever the essential character in place of the second and third in this account, they're certainly subordinate in existence and power to the king. But it's an account nonetheless of a cosmic order that is also a causal or explanatory account. All things are for the sake of him, Plato says. And that fact, or maybe the king himself, there's a slight grammatical ambiguity there, is responsible for, or the cause of, all the noble or beautiful things. In this account, then, the totality of the cosmic whole in which we find ourselves, referred to as all things, is oriented by or toward a universal rule. So it's a well-ordered causal or explanatory account. Second, the leader, the first cause or principle, is personified and described as a king. All things are governed by a wise and beneficent ruler, by a king, as opposed to a tyrant. That would be the connotation of king in Greek philosophy, Greek at the time. Third, very little is said here, right? But the one thing that is said, the one particular class of beings that is referred to, the noble or beautiful things, and the only thing that's said about them, they are explicitly said to have been caused by the highest and first entity in the cosmos. This portrayal of the cosmos, then, is one in which the entity to which every other being owes its existence or its purpose is distinguished above all by its special causal relationship to the beautiful or noble things. It's a cosmos in which the wellspring of beauty, that element of human experience that most powerfully announces the existence of a spiritual depth in the world to which our own souls are attuned, is to be found at the most exalted level of a natural universal hierarchy of principles or causes. In other words, beauty in this account is not in the eye of the beholder, but has objective reality beyond any merely human vantage point. Beauty is no epiphenomenal outgrowth of a fundamentally material or subhuman organic process. It belongs to a fundamental dimension of objective reality. In short, Plato here describes a world in which our most profound longing to be at home in the whole is basically satisfied. Now we should note that up to this point, the presentation is very much in keeping with what we saw in letter 6. Philosophy culminates in knowledge of a wise and beneficent cosmic deity. But what comes next constitutes a surprising turn from that point of view. 6b, so this is just what occurs right after the passage I just read. So the human soul reaches out to learn about what sort of things they are, looking to the things akin to itself, of which none is in a sufficient condition. Indeed, about the king and the things of which I spoke, there is no such thing. And the soul says after this, well then, but what sort of thing? Still quite enigmatic, but this, O child of Dionysius and Doris, is the question that is responsible for all evils. Or rather, the labor pains coming to be in the soul about this are so responsible. And until one is relieved of them, one never really hits upon the truth. Consider how completely different this is from what we had in letter 6. So far from being that rosy picture where one need only philosophize as much as you can, do your best, and you'll come to know the cosmic deity we all will together. This is a picture in which the inquirer encounters deep psychological pain and distress because of the unavailability or non-existence of what would be satisfying in that regard. I'll leave our examination of letter 2 at that, and note only that for all of its enigmatic character, I think that admission of the necessary painfulness of philosophic inquiry, I don't think that has an equal or a parallel anywhere else in the Platonic writing. And in that sense, as enigmatic as it is, I think this may be, with respect to a certain aspect of philosophy, the most honest statement on philosophy that Plato ever gives. Now, we conclude by examining the account in letter 7. We have a printout of a section of letter 7, the philosophic digression of letter 7. I'm not going to read it all aloud. It's quite dense. The whole passage is longer than what I printed you there. I've broken it down into kind of bullet points that will hopefully help you kind of make sense of it, but I'm not going to read it. I'll quote from it here and there. My basic view, though, is this. The philosophic digression of letter 7 doesn't go near the big revelation of letter 2. Nothing about any cosmic deity, nothing about any disappointment or pain in philosophic inquiry. But if you put this passage together with letter 2, you can see something that we didn't get from letter 2, an explanation. Why? What is this all? What does that all mean in letter 2? So let me try to lay it out. Now this gets, I'll start by just trying to say what Plato says, and I'll use his clarification to try to help clarify it. It's tricky, but I think ultimately it becomes clear. And in fact, it's not such a complicated idea. All right, here's what Plato says. For each of the beings, okay, so for each of the beings, we're dealing with a comprehensive ontology. This is going to be explain something about every being. For each of the beings, there are three things through which science, the Greek word is episteme, knowledge, scientific knowledge of a rigorous kind. I'll go between those terms. For each of the beings, there are three things through which knowledge, scientific knowledge, comes to be. And that knowledge itself is the fourth thing. We'll get to some clarification. The three things, just to list them: name, definition, the Greek word logos, could have a lot of meanings, we'll go definition. Name, definition, image. And then science, knowledge, the fourth. Okay, so those are the four. Now, Plato says, take this one example and learn from this example how this works for everything. The example, circle, that's a name. Okay? Definition, that which is everywhere equidistant from the center. Okay, definition of circle. Image, what does image mean? Plato says, that which is drawn and erased, turned on a lathe, and destroyed. So in other words, the images means material instances, examples of circles, which we perceive with our senses, and which, crucially, as Plato emphasizes, are finite, destructible, in fact, bound to be destroyed or to decay over time. So then, by way of these three things, words which we hear or see, images which we see or touch, by these three perceptible, sensible things, we ultimately obtain knowledge, episteme, scientific knowledge. And that knowledge itself is the fourth thing belonging to the being in question. Now, the thing is, there aren't just four. There are five. When Plato lays this out at the top, he says, there is need to set down as fifth the very thing that is knowable and is truly a being. In other words, if you have knowledge, what's the knowledge of? It's not of this circle or that circle. It's not of the sound circle or the series of sounds or words that make up the definition that Plato gave. It's of what those all refer to, what they all belong to, what they are the name and definition and image of. That's what the science is of. That's what the knowledge is of. As Plato points out, all those instances and all the words, all the perceptible things are temporary, finite, changeable, destructible. But what you get knowledge of when you have scientific knowledge of circles is of the circle itself, that which we don't perceive but which we know, which is eternally unchanging, unaffectable. Okay, it's pretty familiar if you know some Platonic philosophy, metaphysics, but it's interesting that Plato begins by saying there's a need for us to set this down. He doesn't just say, here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He says 1, 2, 3, that gives, and then you get the fourth. And then we also need to set this down as fifth. It's almost like he's saying, and we're forced. It's not what we're here to do, but we have no choice. We have to set down as fifth the knowable thing itself. Now, there's some sense in saying that, as you can see just by my attempt to explain it and work through it, it almost feels like, well, there's a kind of grammatical necessity to lay down as fifth. Because if you're going to say you have knowledge of it, what is it you have knowledge of? It's got to be of something, it's not this or that. But I think that's really just scratching the surface. Plato says not only that we need to set down the known thing as a fifth, but that knowable thing itself is what is truly a being. That's very Platonic. The perceptible is not as truly a being, does not exist as truly, to use terminology doesn't apply so much to Plato, but still, does not exist as truly as the imperceptible knowable things. Those are the true beings. Why is that necessary? Why do we have to say that? I think we can see, we're helped in understanding that if we try to do without positing the real existence of this fifth, the knowable thing itself. So let's then pretend for a moment, if we can stomach it, to be materialistic empiricists, which means we'll say that what we know, the only things we know are what we know through the senses, and nothing further. We do not certainly posit the existence of imperceptible true beings of which this or that is merely an image. There are only the physical objects themselves. They alone are the true beings. But now the difficulty is, if there is no circle itself, of which this circle and that circle are only instances, then what do we mean by saying that they are circles, or even that they're approximately circles? Plato admits later, part of the passage I didn't get to, the images never have the geometrical perfection of the circle itself. It's not a true line, it's not truly round or straight parts, fine, whatever, that's not the point. The point is, what do we mean by saying that they are circles at all, that they're images of circles? All we could say, I think, is, well, this thing reminds me of that thing. When I see this, I think of that one. And we can associate a sound with that, circle or whatever else. But are we saying anything from this point of view that could be said to be objectively true of the objects themselves? Aren't we rather admitting that any attempt to identify categories, classes, or patterns in nature is just an exercise in cataloging human reactions to various objects? But the reactions have no connection to any underlying truth about the things we're reacting to. It's not that this is a circle, it's that it's just I saw that and I thought of the other thing. But if we can't create, if there are no real classes or categories, patterns, in the things themselves, then what of scientific knowledge? Isn't it impossible? Plato puts it a certain way that I think is very telling later on in part of what's printed out. He refers to scientific knowledge of the fifth. Science is of the fifth. If there is no fifth, there is no science. There is no object for that knowledge. You can't have science of just the objects. But we have to remember that Plato has advised us not just to think about circles, but to take the example of the circle and to apply it to every other being. And helpfully, he gives us a list. He says, here are all the things that this works for. And I'll highlight just a couple. One that's obviously extremely important is the good, the noble, beautiful, and the just. That's on the list. That obviously needs to be attended to very carefully. But also, all bodies, he says. That's not to say animal or human bodies, but any incorporeal, any physical body. Natural and artificial, he says, including a reference to the Empedoclean or the Aristotelian elements, fire, water, earth, and air. Is any physics possible without the positing of these metaphysical fifths, we can ask? Can we ever say these two things are both water, they're both oxygen atoms, they're both electrons, they're both matter, they're both bodies? Or aren't you just saying, I see that and I think of that? Unless you have these metaphysical fifths. But the problem is, let's say we say, all right, good, we're done with material. I mean, and by the way, this was, I think, in a way, what was seen by Hume about the empiricism of the Enlightenment natural scientists, and which Kant recognized the importance of. But then let's say we say, all right, fine, so we reject that. That doesn't work. The world can't have anything of the character that we seem to think that it has unless we have these fifths. But to posit those metaphysical Platonic fifths is only the beginning of our problems, really, because there's a well-known problem with this, and it's well known because it arises with Plato's theory of the forms, or ideas, of which all of this is highly reminiscent, obviously. It's a problem of participation. How can there be any real relationship between these beings of totally disparate characters? Perceptible, finite images, material instances on one hand, and the imperceptible, knowable things themselves, the true beings. How can one even speak of having an image of something imperceptible that's never acted upon in any way? That issue is not raised in this passage, although Plato knew full well that it was critical. The dialogue that's of most importance here would be the Parmenides. But there is one mention of participation, and it comes up in the following way. Plato eventually, in the passage I printed, expands the fourth as a category to include not only episteme, not only science or scientific knowledge, but also true opinion and mind, all of them belonging together under the heading of the fourth because they, as opposed to the other three, are not found in shapes or sounds, but in souls. And without getting into the weeds of the text, I'll say I think the introduction of mind is especially important. Plato says mind of everything comes closest to the fifth. And eventually he speaks of the indispensability of mind to our ability to participate in science of the fifth. The great question really is what to make of our experience as minds. Because that experience seems to announce to us the existence of these true imperceptible beings, which govern the character of all the things we perceive. Notice that mind and soul do not appear in the list that Plato gives of things that work just like the circle. You have character in souls as mentioned, but souls themselves are not mentioned, and mind certainly. We do not obtain science or knowledge of mind through perception of instances. We know of mind because it is that with which we are aware of our perceptions. Is mind a being? Does mind have a fifth? What would that mean? What is mind? Is it what it seems to be? Does it connect us to the genuine nature of reality? Or does it merely deceive us into thinking that that's what's happening? Recall that the great difficulty in letter 2 is that the soul reaches out in the cosmos to find an order and principle like itself, but none exists. I think that Plato's letters help us to see enough about the problem of philosophy to understand why a distorted version was necessary for the sake of Plato's political undertakings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to mention, it might have seemed an oversight when I, in introducing you, said you were once a Spartan and left it at that.
Yeah.
It wasn't an oversight. I didn't want to dazzle everyone with your titles and accomplishments.
No, I thought that was much more appropriate.
Well, now that they've been dazzled by the thing itself, I can add that Ariel is also an assistant professor at Wayne State University and is the author of Socrates and Alcibiades, which is a wonderful book on Alcibiades.
Right. And Socrates.
And Socrates, yes. Some would say, yeah.
Some would say.
In any event, having said that, questions?
Yes.
I thought that was very good, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
I was struck by a parallel, and I don't know if you would make anything of this, or if I'm completely off base here, so if that's the case, tell me. Between something in the first excerpt from letter 7, this very famous statement that's evocative of the line about philosopher kings in the Republic, specifically the not ceasing from evils. And then there's a reference to evils in 6b, I think it was. There's an account of this question is responsible for all evils. So do you draw any connection between these two things? I mean, and I guess the substantive question would be the first is this political point.
Yes.
Is there a connection between the thought that philosopher kingship would be necessary to solve all these evils, and then the thought that the cause of those evils is somehow this failure to find what we want to find and understand?
I know what the connection is. I want to see if you know it. I'm just kidding. No, I'm not sure. I have to admit that line in the Enigmas passage about the labor pains being the cause of all evils, I find very perplexing. It's just such because the difficulty is this. The best I can think to say is, once one becomes concerned about the difficulty of finding a kind of governing cosmic deity being that would account for the reality of the noble and beautiful, one could understand how that is a painful dilemma with a kind of moral character. I mean, a kind of an impasse regarding the character of nobility, and virtue and morality. And so one could see how, one could imagine how somebody's saying, and that can be the cause of many bad things. But of all bad things, I mean, all bad things emanate from the labor pains over that question. It seems to me, I don't even know quite that everybody experiences the labor pains over that question. Maybe they do. Maybe that would be an important thing to consider. I'm not sure. I just find the statement so far-reaching or so broad as to be really quite perplexing. And now, there is, of course, I mean, just thinking about it, there is, of course, this. If you say that it's resolved, those evils are, that those labor pains are resolved by the culmination of philosophic inquiry. You get through the labor pains and you then come to understand these things as they really are. So philosophy is the resolution. And so I suppose one could imagine the idea would be, once philosophy comes into political power, then the resolution of those difficulties will kind of emanate from those philosophic rulers through their decrees and judgments and decisions and actions through to the whole society. And then because the philosophers have seen their way through the obstacle that is the source of all evils, that their rule would be able to free us from all evils. I mean, I think that makes a certain amount of sense. But yeah, I mean, so I guess that would be, I mean, I'm really working it out on the fly, but I think that makes sense. But I'm also not inclined to push it too hard because I'm not really, what turns on it. I mean, Plato doesn't stress that, doesn't emphasize it. I don't see why he would particularly need to be coy about it if that's, the claim he wants to make. He says it in a more concrete way there in letter 7. He says it's because of their ability to see justice clearly. And so, I don't know. I think there's a way to make it work.
Because of that?
Oh, that's why philosophy holds the potential to cure us of all our ills as philosophy. Because Because from correct philosophy, we can come to see private and public justice correctly. So I think that's, I would, want to start there. But I think, you could draw the connection and even make an interesting argument, but whether it's better than, what you find otherwise, I'm not sure.
One off the top of my head, would the achievement of justice in practice through the institution of philosopher kingship somehow serve to dispose of the troubling thoughts that are kind of referred to more in the latter?
Yeah, this is the difficulty anyway. Why philosophy? This is another problem. Why? It's one thing to say, why would philosophy overcome that problem of political trust that Plato emphasizes early on? That's a question I was asking. Another question is, how is it going to even work then after that we're going to be cured of all our ills? That's it. That's a real tough one. And one interesting thing is, you might think that the idea was, what he means is those people living in that community. But actually it becomes clear later on, the intention is or at least as Dion understood it, and I think we have to say Plato, encouraged him to understand it that way. No, it means all human beings. Once you get philosophy in place in one city, then it's going to kind of shine out like a beacon, and everyone will see what the resolution is. And so it's I'm not afraid to say an outlandish claim, so yeah. So I agree with you, I suppose. That I guess I would say I suspect that Plato knew that was a problem that was not easily solved on the basis of the text or any other thing.
Yes.
You see any differences or tensions in the account of the forms presented in the seventh letter and the Republic?
Yeah, do you see it? No. I think so. One of the questions is, sure. For example, the good isn't mentioned here. The idea of the good. You don't.
Beautiful.
Yeah, right. But especially the idea of the good in the Republic. The good is mentioned here, but the idea of the good in the Republic holds this especially important role. The whole thing doesn't work without it. Nothing actually has being, it seems, without the idea of the good. So, and we don't get that here. Now, I mentioned that Plato neglects to take up the problem of participation in the account here in the letters. But actually, he also doesn't mention participation in the Republic, which is interesting. And so, in a way, that's almost maybe more of a similarity, that the idea is a little bit more like its images. The two sides of the divided line, one are said to be images of the other, and so there's maybe something of rather of a similarity there. Neither of them kind of touches that problem or question. I guess what I would say is this, having stalled for time a little bit. I think in the Republic, I think what's unique about the account of the letters is that read closely, what it really explains is what the problem is that leads us to need, as I say, something like what the character of that need is. Whereas in the Republic, and so that means that it's kind of stripped bare in a sense. What's said in the letters is just kind of, here's the structure of our experience that presents the kind of problems of metaphysics or epistemology to us. And in a way it tells us, and you could resolve it in this direction, but it doesn't go that far. It's not that elaborate. The Republic contains a version of a much more fully elaborated spelling out, fleshing out of that idea. And designed specifically for the sake of the interlocutor, Glaucon, And so attendant, therefore, upon all the things that Plato thinks he needs, as Socrates, Socrates there thinks he needs to say and do for Glaucon. So that would be the kind of big picture. That's where I would say all of the specific differences come from. Then another thing to notice, by the way, is the other places where something like the idea of the forms comes out. The Phaedrus, the Phaedo, although the Phaedo may be a little closer to the letters than that you're, and also the Parmenides, but that too, in a way, comes closer to the letters. But certainly the Phaedo, compare the Phaedrus and the Republic. They're very different. They're both kind of, mythical or mythological, clearly, but the way things work in the two versions is different. Also, the Timaeus, you have something like the form pretty clearly in the Timaeus. It's also different. So I think what that means is Plato, in different contexts, was willing to elaborate slightly different versions of this thing. And that shows us, I think, it invites us to try to triangulate from these different versions. Can you see what it is that's making Plato think, what's generating these different elaborations in the first place? And maybe letter 7 gives us something like the seed of all the various instances. Very speculative, but that's what do you think?
I think it's good.
Okay.
But I mean,
Yeah.
I'm struck always by the image in the Timaeus of the demiurge stamping the form on the matter, and the matter won't hold it.
But I found there's a passage in the Timaeus that I came upon recently working on this that I found extremely striking and helpful, because effectively Timaeus says, as for the question of participation, of how there is going to be this kind of pre-substance, just kind of formless stuff that is then going to participate, is going to reflect, become an image of, and kind of gain the form, take on the form of music. How that's going to happen, total open question. Let me cast my vote on how I think it goes, and then we'll go from there. But the formulation, I just saw it recently, so I know it's around 51E, is a really interesting, I think, statement of Timaeus' awareness of a problem, the problem of participation. This in the end perhaps doesn't work, and but then the Parmenides is the most important, I think, instance of this.
I was just, on the last page of your packet, I was wondering, is this ontology, as you put it, is it metaphysical or not? Because it seems to me to kind of just make some common sense. That, a squirrel has an image of an acorn or a tree. But what human beings can do is then we can name it. That's a tree, that's an acorn. And then we can take this further step as well, which is to provide a speech or a definition about what the thing is. And it makes some sense to describe, knowledge, of course, is the possession of that ability. And the fifth, as Plato puts it, it's just the being that you initially have an image of, that you name, that you define, and ultimately come to know, if indeed it's knowable. So I guess, doesn't that just kind of make some common sense?
I mean, I think that in a way the point of it is that it makes common sense. I mean, when he says there's a need for us to do this, I think in a way it's the common sense need of, it's just the thing that you know. I mean, the thing that you know, that you have scientific episteme of, is not this.
Right.
It's the various, it's maybe plastic and circles, or various cups. I mean, he says artificial bodies too. So, in a way, yes, but I think it nonetheless points us directly into the difficulty that is metaphysical, which is, what's the status of that fifth? What is it? I mean, and moreover, how are all of these images of it? And in other words, the problem, as I say, the problem of participation. I don't think you can. I think that highfalutin versions spelled out kind of elaborations of this that you see, for example, in the Republic, in in a way, point you have to do something like this to fully spell it out. And even then, you have problems. But really, the Parmenides, I think, the early part of the Parmenides, but then of course all of it, because I think it's all about this, really shows Socrates struggling, trying to find some way to make this work. Well, what if they're just patterns? What if they're just patterns, and what if it's just in our mind? And Parmenides is always right there with. And incidentally, I think he's often kind of saying, "I think you know this, by the way, Socrates. That you run into this problem." And Socrates, "Oh yeah, I do know that." And so my impression, as much as this can stand as a kind of common sense way of putting it, to really work out how it works, I think you run into tremendous difficulty. I think you do. To say that, and incidentally, for example, to say that's the true being, that's what is truly a being. These things aren't true beings, but those are. And these are images of those. I don't really know how you make it work.
Well, I was very struck by that
Yeah.
at the end of the day, the thing that is knowable and truly a being, because then in this list you have reference to the good, the noble, and the just, and artificial things.
Yeah.
In other words, you have the potential, at least, for non-beings entering into the equation, and then on the previous page, right, there's no such thing as this can,
Yes.
which seems to open up the possibility that the crucial endpoint of learning is, or of this process of knowledge is in fact knowledge of ignorance at the end.
Yeah, I think that. So that
Of
would be
some things.
that would be of some things. I'm not. I mean, maybe, but my inclination is to think that the problem runs very, very deep, and in fact, it comes to be knowledge of ignorance of, so to speak, everything. I think the limits are almost suffocating, and that is really what makes the problem so severe, and what makes it so that Plato really has to distort it. And the interesting thing, as I say, is I think Kant, really looking at Hume, saw it, but Kant thought he could escape it, and so Kant kind of has this very hopeful character in a certain way. But I think what that means is Kant, without the Kantian solution, shows us the depth of the problem quite clearly, more clearly than Plato was ever willing to express it. But that's my thought about what we get from reflection on this. There's no way that anyone would ever think what I've said about it in this exposition is conclusive, but that's the direction I'm thinking about. So,
wonderful presentation, really fascinating, makes me very excited about your work on this.
I can put you down for a copy of the book.
Just a couple of questions. So, what do we learn from the letters? And you've touched on this a little bit about Plato's use of Socrates, or his decision to, his primary, vehicle for communicating philosophy, his decision to use Socrates, and is there more light that's shed on that? Does your reading of and your elaboration of this particular very fundamental problem illuminate that? So that's one question I'd like to hear you talk about. And then maybe a second one, somewhat related to that. It's very clear from these letters, if it wasn't already clear from the dialogues, that Plato intends to beautify philosophy and to make it a grand and great thing. I don't think anybody can come away from an experience with the Platonic dialogues not under the, and this is, I think, alluded to in one of the decent soul's responses to certain of these teachings. But Plato seems to want to turn that up to 11, so to speak. Do the letters help us understand the considerations that underlie that decision? So either of those questions, both ideally.
Great questions. The thing about Socrates in the letters is how strange the presentation of Socrates is. I mean, everything is just there are Socrates is mentioned 2, 3, 4 times. And one you have here, where the implication is, it's often been taken to be, and I think it's been hard to escape, is the Socrates of the dialogues was not the historical Socrates. I beautified him. I made him new. That is kind of, that idea is reinforced very subtly by the other mentions of Socrates. The second one is in letter 7, where I alluded to it, where Plato refers to the disillusionment with politics he underwent as a result of seeing how Athens treated Socrates twice. Once with under the 30 with Leon Salamis, and the other with the tribe. But you know, so many strange things about it. He never says Socrates was his teacher. He says, an aged man, my friend. And no, I think what's interesting is calling him old. The Socrates of the dialogues was new, was young. New, young, naos. And the historical Socrates mentioned in letter 7 was the old Socrates. The real Socrates was old, not young. And so there's this distinction, I think. Plato's almost kind of emphasizing, no, you know, in real life, Socrates, he was an old man, he was a good friend of mine. And then, by the way, the charges against Socrates are mentioned in the context of it. And impiety is mentioned, but not corruption. And then finally, well, there's one more mention of the Socratic dialogue. Plato refers to the Socratic logoi in letter 13. So he mentions Kebes, I think, and he says you'll recognize his name if you read the Socratic logos on the soul. But the strangest thing is in letter 11, where Plato begins, I'm sorry I can't come to you to have, very, very much paraphrasing, but to help you with your project of founding a colony. I told you the best thing would be for you to come to me. Second would be for me or Socrates to come to you. And Socrates can't come because he has strangury, which is a disease of the bladder that results in painful urination. That's a gloss. It's my gloss. He doesn't go into that detail. But now it's pointed out this must be long after Socrates' death, and so it's guessed that this must be young Socrates from the Sophists and Statesmen. But I think that's kind of preposterous for reasons I guess I won't go on long enough about this. But it's just, in other words, every mention, you turned, as I said at the beginning, you turned to the letters hoping you'll get a little behind the scene, behind the music, behind the philosophy, Plato and Socrates. What was it all about? What did they talk about? What must it have been like to know Socrates and learn from him? And every mention of Socrates is deflating. But I do think this line, the first mention of Socrates, everything I wrote is of Socrates being beautiful. I think that means, that means, by the way, also the laws, the Timaeus, the dialogues where Socrates doesn't play a big role, and I would say the letters, which is the strangest thing, because Socrates is, so emphatically missing in it from the letters. But I think what that would mean then is that the whole project of Plato's writing was for the sake of Socrates in some way. And he beautified him in order to accomplish what he was trying to accomplish. I mean, I would say, just to formulate things simply, I think in a way that really comes out of what you see about Plato and his political activity in the letters, it was for the sake of promoting the reputation of philosophy. And Socrates was the trial and execution of Socrates was a big motivator. I think that collection of things, if that helps it, I think we get an impression, although it's not on every page by any means, it's in fact, maybe these are small indications, but that figure of Socrates was meant to be Plato's way of, it's how Plato lived. You could say it's Plato's representation of philosophy for the sake of that goal. Which is quite similar, actually, to what I would say to your second question, because, you do get this, comparison with Xenophon is very instructive. Xenophon does not have philosophy as this grand, mystical, religious activity. Almost every discussion of philosophy in the letters has this kind of religious connotation. There's this mysticism that's associated with it. And But I think the letters do show that, this was part of Plato's strategy. And the beautified Socrates is kind of the high priest, to make a kind of religion around philosophy, of philosophy. By, on one hand, not exactly lying about what philosophy is about, that it is an inquiry into the first causes and principles and a seeking after a kind of ordering principle in being and mind. But to be much more optimistic in the presentation as to the possibility and even likelihood of reaching the result that is most hoped for at the outset, something like that.
Was Plato the sort of sought-after regional sage that other leaders elsewhere plagiarized, or as part of this, just sort of exaggerated self-importance, perhaps for future readers?
It's very hard to know. If the thing is, if they were real letters, then in a way you could say, well, it's like we had his wiretap, and you can assume the things he said were pretty candid. And the things that he said, were I'm being called on by the leader of Macedon. I have connections to the leader of that he's reaching out to the leader of Aeneas. He's being called on to go help found colonies, and there's this whole episode in Syracuse. Now, if I'm right and it's, as I say, semi-fictional, it becomes much harder to know. But on the other hand, it's one thing for it to be semi-fictional. It's another thing to be made out of whole cloth, and for none of his contemporaries to have said anything about it, for that not to have reached us. It's generally speaking believed he went to Syracuse. He was involved there. We have other historical accounts that do not seem to have originated from the letters that corroborate the idea he was there. These things happened with him and Dionysius and so on. And one thing that he says, and I think it's interesting and important for the interpretation of the text as the kind of work I'm claiming that it is, that Plato is sure to include a mention that by the time he went to Syracuse, he was already quite famous as a philosopher. So, that's right there in the text. Now again, you could say, well, anybody can claim they were famous as a philosopher, but I think there's plenty of historical evidence that would have been so, people going to Athens to study with him and so on. And so I think, yes. Now,
so I guess an alternative interpretation of the wind-up is kind of hyping the profundity of what I'm about to tell you.
Yeah.
You have to burn it.
Yeah.
I have to write it in code.
Right.
But
okay. So, but that's a different question, right? One thing is, was Plato really a famous philosopher, famous for his political philosophy, famous for his doctrine of philosophic rule, and called upon to go and install it in various regimes? And I think, however much is hype, I think that it just seems probably yes, he was. But then the question of what does the activity of philosophy really produce and contain? Is it these grand mystical rites and mysteries that they seem to be? The former is a matter of historical fact. The other is a matter of, so to speak, kind of philosophy as an element and a force in the human condition and what it really is and can do. And so. The way you paraphrase Plato's take on the latter, I endorse that. I think he was, doing something like that, making, as Tobin was saying, beautifying philosophy. But as far as his status in the Greek world, I think it's very interesting to know. He really was. All of his political philosophy that he wrote, it really got him involved in these associations and relationships, and he, at least in one major case, and more than once in that case, went for it.
You know a lot about the manuscript history of these texts, too. I suppose it's not like the Dead Sea Scrolls where the Platonic texts were buried for 2,000 years and they found them.
No.
It was shortly after they were written, they were widespread.
Yes, there's, so we don't have any manuscripts older than the 9th century AD.
Right.
That's quite a bit.
But we know that they were being
But we know that they were being read all the way
discussed
along. We have people who we know lived much earlier who are quoting
Right.
them and so on. So we can trace the kind of spread of the manuscripts almost right all the way back to Plato. The history is actually pretty solid. We know these came out of. Now, some people say not all of them. If Aristotle doesn't mention it, we don't know that it existed before. The first mention that we have of it by someone, and so on. So there are plenty of claims that this thing came from a couple hundred years after. But none of them really, the way that all works in the history that we have, there's almost nothing that can come that long. It's not like anybody's saying this one maybe comes from 500 AD.
Right.
They all must have been pretty close. And so what happened to confuse matters must have been pretty close after the life of Plato. And that holds for the letters too. We have a very early account, or we have a quite early account of a very early account that, which would be, as in less than 2 centuries after Plato, that includes provides a catalog of all 13 letters as we have them. So that catalog existed. That these are the 13 letters of Plato. That was there with the corpus within a couple of centuries of Plato's death.
So I guess in the end, do you think these are authentic? You mentioned there's a controversy about them.
Yeah, I think so to say that they're all authentic would be already controversial. In fact, the tide has shifted now in the opposite direction. The letter that has enjoyed the most solid reputation for authenticity has been 7. And even now, the most recent things that have been major works on letter 7 have been saying, I don't think so. But, so not only is it, so to speak, controversial to say they're all authentic, but I'm saying something that even fewer people are saying. I'm not the first by any means, by the way. There's a really interesting article by a guy named Franz Donz. Important in this. Franz Donz, I have German classicist, 1934, and he wrote this exact thing. He was a short article that says, this is a book, you read it from cover to cover, and it's by Plato. 5 years later, he changed his mind. It's not by Plato, but it's still a book. The point is you read, and then that becomes very, not subjective, but debatable. Is it by Plato, is it not? It depends on what you think Plato would write, could have written. It's not like, somebody made a mistake and I wrote this in 340 BC, forgetting that people in BC wouldn't know it was BC or something silly like that. It's just, do you think Plato wrote this or not? But then he still saw it as a book, as a single work of literature. So that's 1930s, and then here and there over the following decades, people picked up on it, people mentioned it, some people kind of ran with it, but no one ran all that far. And so it remains very minority opinion to say, not only are they all by Plato, but they're not even really letters. On the other hand, it seems to me, and as I try to argue in the book, it seems to me the whole discussion around authenticity changes when you entertain the possibility that they're not really letters. Because the criteria for authenticity are different. If these things were really letters, could Plato have written that really to that person at that point in time? Is one thing. Could Plato have written this as a fictional letter that he never really sent? Is a very different question. The motivation for writing it changes, and it becomes possible to say that something could have been by Plato on very different grounds. So it seems to me that people are altogether kind of missing a point. They're taking letters one by one and saying, could Plato have written that? Whereas the question is, could Plato have written this whole book? And I think there's really no reason at all to think he couldn't have. And in fact, you go back to the origins of these debates and you find, first of all, the people who were having the debates in the first place, they thought all the letters were by Plato. And moreover, that the types of arguments that canon should be used about authenticity here really none of them succeeds in suggesting this is something that Plato couldn't have written. So that part's fun too, but I find I can only, if I start in the talk getting into all that stuff, then I have 5 minutes left to talk about the fifth. That's hardly enough.
Well, thank you.